Hello, and welcome to this new interview in the Instituto Juan de Mariana YouTube channel and our different social networks. My name is Diego Sánchez de la Cruz. I'm the new head of the research for the think tank and a long-time member. And here with me is our very special guest, Hans Jörg Naumer from Allianz and the research division. Hans Jörg, herzlich willkommen. Welcome to the Juan de Mariana Institute and our YouTube channel.
Yeah, hola, it's a pleasure being with you and sharing thoughts. Hello all.
Session. So let's get it started. You've done some amazing work, a very successful book that will soon be available in English, but that has already started this conversation in your home country of Germany. You've been writing about this big disruption that comes with the need to significantly increase green investments, but at the same time, how some of the ideas around this have been misguided so far. So let's just tackle this head on and get on to the serious topics of this debate. Degrowth. I understand that right now Germany is perhaps at the forefront of degrowth thinking and degrowth thought, as some very successful books and authors have come out of your home nation in the past several years and have been pushing this idea that indeed has become popular in other sides of the Western world, of course in Spain. Latin American countries always play a role to the debate of ideas in Spain, so that obviously permeates all the way back to the other side of the Atlantic. So, I mean, why is degrowth not a solution, not a proper framework for dealing with the sort of challenges that we may arise in terms of environmental sustainability, and of course, the ongoing and ever-existing necessities and problems of running a competitive economy?
Yeah, that's a 1 billion euro question, I would say, Diego, and you nailed it fantastically well. So degrowth seems to come out to a certain extent, at least out of Germany, perhaps other regions as well. And they're making all the same kind of sound around it, saying, okay, look, we have some, it's being called planetary boundaries, so some kind of neo-Malthusianism, so to say, coming along with it. So the end of the world is getting closer, and therefore we cannot afford to grow any longer because simple philosophy, well, in case we go ahead growing in economic terms, that would mean that carbon emissions would remain or would be on the rise again or rising even further, and therefore we cannot afford it. We need to do everything and anything to prevent climate change from happening. That's what it's all about. And I would say, well, it's always good to live in a sustainable way. So in the case of thinking about what you are doing, how you are using your stuff, and so on and so forth. But let me be very, very clear. It wouldn't make any sense at all to say, well, we stop growing because that seems to be solely a debate, let's say, in the industrialized part of the world, or even in some parts of the industrialized part of the world. And that's in global terms a minority. Let's face this. And you might say, well, carbon footprint is higher in Germany than in some countries in Africa, and carbon footprint might be higher in Spain than somewhere else in Asia. Fair enough, point taken. But degrowing does not take into account a simple fact, or two simple facts being very close with each other. One fact is population, or demographic wise, the population still is growing, will be growing till the year 2100. We have to expect 2.5 billion roughly more people checking in on planet Earth till the year 2100. More people does mean either more growth or much more degrowth in other countries. So that's simply not imaginable. And the second thing is, don't forget this, we are having our 17 so-called Sustainable Development Goals, the so-called 17 SDGs. And the SDGs have a very smart program. In one word, it's growing out of poverty and growing out of hunger and so on. So we need growth to help the needy people of the world. In other, just another number on this, I found it quite fascinating that the World Health Organization came up with a paper a while ago saying, look, we have to talk about 3 billion forgotten people And I scratched my head asking myself, how could one forget even one human being? But talking about 3 billion, that's quite a number, isn't it? But what they tried to nail simply was there are 3 billion people that are already on our planet, but they do not live in somehow a standard being close, not to others perhaps, but to a good living, in a sense that they do not have sanitation, they do not have sufficient to eat, they do not have clean energy, and so on and so forth. Taking this all together, this forgotten 3 billion and the forthcoming 2.5 billion people, in my eyes, it's absolutely not, I absolutely cannot understand that someone is even thinking about degrowing, because that would mean that we cannot help those that need it most and those that are to be expected.
So there's one point that is also made very often here, is that this idea of that we don't only stop growth, but we somewhat redistribute growth globally. And we know that in the end, large redistribution schemes, even at a continental level, we've seen in Europe, and of course internally in our countries within just pure microeconomics dynamics, we see that ultimately they are not a way to grow the pie. They're just a way to change the incentives in which the pie could be grown, and very often change them for the worse. And at the same time, on the net, there is not a real gain, because, for example, you run some figures and you show how even if we take these redistribution efforts as a one-off, they're not able to fix any of the other problems that we are discussing in a sustainable manner. So in the end, it just comes back to the question. So far, the only way humanity has escaped chronic poverty seems to be sustained economic growth. And now we're talking about making sustained economic growth sustainable economic growth, but in no way, shape, or form replacing that with redistribution at a global scale in the name of a climate emergency or any other reason.
Yeah, you nailed it, Diego. And that's a very valid and very important point we need to keep in mind, because when, let's say, talking about growth or degrowth, the end of growth, and then having minus or negative developments on that side, simply would mean not only a zero-sum game for all of us, but even a negative-sum game. And let's assume for a moment we would not have a negative-sum game, but just a zero-sum game in a sense that we are, as you mentioned, redistribute wealth. What would this mean? Well, just a few facts. When talking about what could be redistributed, we should know that in the Western Hemisphere, Europe, USA, Australia, for instance, we have on average purchasing power in purchasing power adjusted terms of somewhere around 65 to 70 US dollars per day. Okay, that's what we can consume in any other way. When it comes to the world's average, we are talking about 16 US dollars, and the needy ones I just referred to, those the 3 billion forgotten ones, they are somewhere at around 11 US dollar per day, and most of them are even below this, a bit above poverty level, which is somewhere around 3 US dollars a day. So having that said, you need to close the gap from 65, let's say, down to somewhere of 16 US dollars in purchasing power parity a day to get the other ones up to 16 on average. Could you imagine this for, let's say, Spain, for Portugal, for any country in Europe, for the United States? That's not to be, that's not feasible in any way, I would say, and that will be just a status quo thinking, and then said we have not yet touched upon those that are to be expected. Yeah, and the more people are to be expected on planet Earth, and the more degrowth thinking takes its toll, that would mean more people redistributing even further below 16 US dollars a day. So that's simply not possible. So we need to find another way out of the situation.
There's one thing that has always caught my attention when I look at the numbers connecting economic activity and sustainability performance. The decoupling that between economic growth and, for example, CO2 and other greenhouse emissions seems to be fairly standard among most Western developed nations. In some cases, it's been going on since the late 80s even. In other cases, it's been a reality since the last 20, 25 years. But that means that there is a significant lag here in between what the data is telling us, which should be room for maybe more optimism on solutions that are based on growth and economic activity under a market economy system, and the prevailing rhetoric that more or less seems to believe that just because in absolute terms numbers may have gotten higher, they fail to take into account the fact that in relative terms, the drives for efficiency have been very high in the last several decades. And that's fairly ever not presented in public debate.
And that's a very important point, because that leads the way out of the situation we are in. Because let's face it, it seems to me, for me, quite clear as an economist that we need to decarbonize the economy, in the sense that we need to go or come to a net zero carbon emission or greenhouse gas emission economy. And what you just mentioned is fascinating. On average, one could say that starting in the 60s, our energy efficiency overall in the industrialized world has risen 5 to 6-fold approximately. So it depends a bit on which economy we are talking about. But having said this, we are producing 6 times more with the same energy than we have produced decades ago. And let me share one chart which is even more fascinating, I would say. Just a second. Here we go. And that chart tells us a story of where we need to go and where we come from. And that's a chart alluding to what I call, or what's being called, a decoupling from real economic growth and CO2 or carbon emissions. I chose the United States here simply as it's the world's largest economy, but a couple of seconds later in my next chart, I will touch upon Spain and Portugal as well, because it's more or less alike, and it couldn't be more fascinating. What you see here is a development that dates back to the early 1800s, so more than 200 years of economic growth, so to say. And what you can clearly see, there is some kind of a decoupling between real growth and real economic terms, so GDP, gross domestic product in real terms, and energy consumption and CO2 emissions. And to simply make it possible to compare 3 numbers that are unit-wise quite different, I chose a simple trick. I rebased them in the 70s, 1970, to simply 1. Asking myself, okay, what can we learn from this? What has happened since then? And the outcome is clear. In real terms, the US economy has grown by 3.7-fold. That's fantastic, I would say. And when it comes to carbon emissions have grown till the turn of the century approximately by up to 0.5% or 50 percentage points, and now they are trailing back slowly but at least steadily. And having this, the history tells us 2 things. One thing is, without that kind of decoupling, we wouldn't make a conversation today about climate change, because it'll be simply too late. Yeah, we need to keep in mind that the decoupling already kicked in, and fortunately for the best for the environment and of course for us. And second thing is, the only way out of climate change or carbon emissions, we need to decouple growth from carbon emissions. It has already started, as to be shown here, but forward looking, we need to get back to what's being called a net zero economy, so a net zero carbon economy in the sense that we produce without any kind of greenhouse gases. That's where we need to go. Just let me switch one slide forward. Here Spain and Portugal, and as 1990 is usually taken, at least by the EU Commission, for as a base year. I chose it here as a base year once again, and again it's being based to 100 to make it comparable, and that's real growth in Spain. Here it's to be seen for Portugal. There hasn't been that much, or it has carbon emissions have risen in sync until 2005 approximately for Spain, but so decoupling already kicked in already. Fortunately, I should add, of course, a bit comparable for Portugal as well, and many other countries, I should add. So I'm just alluding here to Spain and Portugal, but you can see it, as you just mentioned, for many countries, not to say for any industrialized countries and more emerging markets as well, that there is a decoupling ongoing.
There is one thing that has always baffled me when we discussed the way to move forward, which is that very often we're imposing what could be considered to be very significant costs on daily activities of regular civilians that not necessarily yield a significant change in the degree of CO2 emissions and other factors. For example, let me just give you one number. The Spanish government right now has opened up the possibility of restricting travel by plane. De facto, most of the domestic flights would not be allowed if that scheme was to press forward. Similar ideas have been flaunted and even put into motion slowly in countries like France. But then when you look at the overall impact on Spain's CO2 production, it's fairly low. We're talking about basically grounding an entire transport industry for a very limited gain. And that limited gain, I also try to always analyze this in static, not in static, but in dynamic terms. For example, with the pandemic, it was obvious that we did that sort of policy. Of course, we did it because of a healthcare emergency, right? But by doing so, we did, at the short run, see a decline in emissions, okay? But as soon as you put back the economy in motion and things get back to normal, what you find out looking is that reduction wasn't sustainable because it created economic pain for millions of Spaniards. And at the end of the day, a poorer economy is less able to finance its investments in the future. So that's something I have always worried about. A lack of a cost-benefit approach in these sort of policies that may sound easier to understand, easier to present to the public, but at the end of the day, they are very restrictive and do not yield that much results. What's your take on that sort of approach that we see very often?
I couldn't agree more, Diego. That's fantastic, as you put it, because simply stopping some things from doing, like you just mentioned, having national flights within Spain, same debate here in Germany, or we are discussing a speed limit on our Autobahn, yeah, and there is nothing more sacred than an Autobahn in Germany, so this high speed race, as you know, and I always scratch my head asking, don't we have better solutions? Then the only thing I come up with is simply, well, we need to have a market mechanism to get a very efficient solution, because efficiency does mean to reduce maximum carbon emissions for the least investment spending, to make it feasible at the very end of it. If you just start here and there, that's some kind of, well, piecemeal engineering, as Karl Popper would have put it, in the sense that big government has to regulate our all lives more and more to get to a net zero economy. The best solution, the most efficient solution would be, and it already has started in the European Union. Unfortunately, it's not that much under debate, because we have seen quite some progress throughout the last couple of months. The most efficient mechanism for me as an economist always is, in case there comes something along with a price, it needs to get a price tag. in a sense that when carbon emissions do bother climate change, do interfere with our own, with the environment, it needs to come with a price. And then we'll factor it all in. In other words, when you're thinking about catching a flight from, let's say, Barcelona to Madrid or somewhere else, you could make your choice, but of course it will cost more, and it already does because it's figured in, or it's already implemented, because carbon emissions from your flight come with a price tag. And while having that, I'd like to show you the price for carbon emissions. And that's the best mechanism, as said, I could imagine. What I plotted here is the so-called the price for 1 ton of carbon emissions by the so-called European trading scheme. Today it's somewhere around 80 euros a ton.
Yes,
that's quite interesting because it has clearly steering function. Prices have a steering function and driving us towards more efficiencies. And the good thing is that the European trading scheme has not only been implemented a couple of years ago, and it's really effective in those sectors that are already covered with it. It will also cover in the near future other sectors, so such as real estate, for instance, and that'll be one of the most important steps to be imagined. So working with that kind of European trading scheme, that'll be the best we can do. And going one step further ahead, even, you would say, well, I'm market economist, fair enough, and carbon emissions are not bound to any kind of border. So in case you cannot emit them here in Europe or in the EU, you will probably transfer your production to some other places in the world, right? Because at the very end of it, it's a matter of competition worldwide. Other places also have some kind of trading schemes, unfortunately, or taxes on carbon emissions. But best would be to have one global price or one global market for carbon emissions. That's not yet where we are. That's unfortunately not to be expected, I would say. But the second best to this will be a climate club. So we could, as the EU, invite others, saying, "Come on, join us, be part of our club. We can trade as we have used to do for decades now, because you also price your carbon emissions via more or less comparable mechanism." And that's where the solution looking forward is really to be expected. So I'm a big fan of that climate club, and I'm quite happy that the G7 meetings, the last 2 or 3 G7 meetings, already made at least some baby steps, but at least some steps towards a climate club.
There's one point that is made also in your book, in your research on this matter as well, where you discuss the importance to see this as a disruptive moment for the global economy that can be obviously be leveraged upon to unleash a new wave of growth. But with every disruption comes destruction, also creation. So it brings us back to the Joseph Schumpeter term. There's one thing with creative destruction, though. For it to work smoothly and to yield the most net gains, we need these markets to be as flexible enough to accommodate the part that is destructed into the part that is created, so to speak. And I am afraid that the level of and the degree of economic freedom that we enjoy these days is not being growing as much as it should be. And in some countries and some areas of the world, of the developed world, have been on the decline. What's your take on that? Our current levels of economic freedom and how they accommodate with the whole climate agenda?
Oh, well, that's quite a topic to deal with. Yes, but you're absolutely right. It's interlinked. So economic freedom, in other words, globalization or deglobalization comes along with the matter or the need for decarbonizing our economy. And that's where it's getting even more interesting because, yes, there is some kind of deglobalization going on. It started to unfold. Think about the term of friendshipping. So dealing with those who are closer in your view of the world, in your freedom, in your liberty, and so on, than others. That already kicked in. But even more so, there is not only tough competition on the new energy or how to produce all that kind of technology being needed to decarbonize. It's also some kind of a distorted competition. So what I mean is, China, for the best of our environment and climate, made very bold decisions on stopping carbon emissions from China. That's really good news. They want to be carbon neutral in 2060, later than we are, fair enough, but they started later than we did. Therefore, it's okay, I would say. But they also started to invest heavily into technologies that are being needed for to decarbonize, and therefore that might be a drag on our own competitiveness here in Europe. That's a very valid point. We need to watch this very carefully. A climate club could help clearly, and on the other side, it's the other side of the Atlantic. The United States, they implemented, as you know, as an answer to the pandemic, they implemented the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is nothing else than subsidizing the economy with a clear focus on carbon neutrality. So it's about energy, new energy, and so on. Okay, there are tough distortions unfolding. We have to admit this. Not sure whether the EU Commission or we as countries in the EU are well advised to also subsidize our economy, because that'll be probably a rat race at the very end of the story. But bottom line is there might be some kind of deglobalization unfolding, but the mega trend towards decarbonization has got many catalysts.
Mm. The capital expenditures that are required by the sort of transition that we're moving towards are enormous. And they're going to be happening in a context of increased monetary volatility with an inflationary crisis like we have not seen in the last 4 years, that we seem to have 4 decades, sorry, which seems to be finally starting to be on the downward slope. But at the end of the day, it's had a tremendous impact. And with interest rates, obviously, not as low as they were before, we could talk about the impact of these low interest rates, which, for example, may have been direct catalysts in that whole inflationary situation. But at the same time, from the point of view of capital expenditure, and at least in this case, expenditures raised through debt, it was a positive scenario. We could have done a lot of these investments with more positive monetary conditions. What do you think the new yield for these projects is? To what extent the economics of green finance have been affected by the changes in the monetary outlook?
Clearly, in a sense, you're right, because at the very end of it, there is a clear connection between investment spending and interest rates or yields. That's quite clear. But I need to add that I'm more than happy that the environment of negative yields, as we had them in many parts in the European or Eurozone, in the US and other parts of the world, has ended because it's absolutely it has been my sense, my feelings are it has been a catastrophe that monetary policy all around the globe distorted prices on money markets, yields, and so on. It was a huge distortion leading to wrong investment decisions, even more so leading states to even bigger spender than before. beforehand, because our ministers of finance seem to think, okay, well, money doesn't cost a thing, we can spend even more than we have done beforehand, and that's backfiring right now. So when you take countries in the Eurozone, not to talk about Germany, we now have to realize it all comes with a price and it fires back. So I'm happy that kind of monetary policy is over. I need to add this. And looking forward, okay, yes, right, it's a drag on investments we need for green finance. But at the end of the story, it's not only investment spendings or decisions are not made solely on a level of yields you have to pay. Of course, it's a matter of profitability. So is it profitable or not? And I would say clearly it is. And here once again, the carbon emission price once again comes into play, because the more people have to, or companies have to realize that CO2 emissions come with a price tag, the more they have to make some bold investment decisions to prevent to prevent carbon emissions from emitting from their own companies. So it's a catalyst. The price tag for carbon emissions is a catalyst for investment spendings, I would say.
Back a few years ago, 2017, I was a co-author of the first ever populism index produced by Timbro, working with the team of Andreas Johansson Heino. I was surprised to find that you thought there was a connection between this economic phenomenon in Europe and the potential resistance against this sort of disruptive change. What can you tell us about the state of populism in Europe? You've presented some research that shows that at the end of the day, the share of populist parties or the share of polarization in the US Senate were somewhere moving around the 10-12 points mark. And these days, they are moving closer to around 1/4 of the electorate in the case of populism in Europe, while the degree of specific polarization has almost doubled in American political system. So to what extent can these dysfunctions in political governance in the Western world derail our ability to tackle big challenges like this one, or like other ones are going in the world right now, geopolitical?
Yeah. That's a fascinating question. Yes, I would say that populism has interferes, of course, with what we call inequality to a certain extent, and the feeling, at least, of not being part of a positive development overall. So populism comes along with the feeling of being left behind, in other words. The only way out, once again, is green growth, not degrowth, because the more you have to redistribute, the more expensive redistribution schemes are, the more or the less you are able to support these people that need it in your own home country, so to say. So we need to grow out of it. And yes, it could derail our way towards decarbonization, for instance, because people might simply shy away saying, okay, it comes with a price, I'm fed of this. We had in Germany, and there's I'm sure many other examples in Europe or Eurozone, EU. We had a tough discussion about replacing our heating, what is it called, our ovens at home, and the population here was clearly against it. And people have to realize that the transformation comes with a price, so to say. We are talking not by coincidence about so-called greenflation. That might be clearly a derailer. Yeah, that's right. But let me add, when I'm talking about carbon emissions should be priced, I'm not talking about an add-on tax to all these taxes we have been paying throughout all the years already. I'm talking about what I have in mind is the so-called climate. I'm not sure how to translate it in a proper way into English, but I would say some kind of climate money. in a sense that yes, you have to pay for your carbon emissions when you heat up your apartment, for instance, when you drive with fuel. You have a car not driven by electricity but by fuel. Then you have to pay a price, and the price will be on the rise. But what you're not paying is a special tax. That's what you're doing currently, but it needs to get changed because it should be redistributed to the people as such. In a sense, that those that emit most or much carbon emissions, they have to pay more. Those who emit less, they pay less, but they all get on average the same. So the incentives of not emitting carbon will be quite high, and that for me will be the best solution to, well, get people on board that are reluctant, saying, okay, climate, what the hell do I have to do with it? What the hell do I have to do with it? It's not my part of the business. I'm too poor. I'm out of job. I don't know what. But they would then see, okay, well, the price for fuel might be higher, the price for heating might rise, but I get it back, and it makes sense to economize more.
Hans Jörg, thank you very much for this conversation. We always like to end on a series of more lighthearted questions. And I was first willing to ask, what's your favorite classic economic author and the famous classic book on economics that you would recommend to anyone curious about this?
What a question. So to start with, the most famous classic is always Friedrich August von Hayek, Road to Serfdom. It's written in the midst of the Second World War, and I read for the first time, I don't know, 25 years ago, and I felt it, but I'm still feeling today. It's written for our times. So we need to be very careful when it comes to economics, how to get it right, to be very efficient, and not to rely on big government as such, but to rely more on a market society, a market economy. That's what I'm very interested in. The next one is I'm a bit reluctant. There are so many fascinating books, but it's written by Taran Acemoglu, How Nations Fail. You've heard about it for sure. A classic, not a classic. It's a bit more than 10 years old.
Classic, yeah.
A modern day classic, you might call it, because what I found fascinating is at the very end of the story, it comes to one bottom line, and the bottom line is we need to have a free market economy. We need to have private ownership, not state ownership, and that's what and strong institutions, in a sense that everyone plays with the same rules, so to say. A fascinating book, once again, brilliant. And when we just talked about populism, there are many answers to be found in it against populism.
Excellent. So we covered a lot of ground today. We talked about decoupling and the decoupling indeed of growth and emissions, also about degrowth, the ongoing topic of these days, unfortunately. We were also delving into the degree to which some energy policies that are being designed may sound flashy or catchy, but are not cost efficient and need to be thought of with more carefulness. We also discussed the future of these sorts of agreements and how do they look like, and the possibility and the roles that the European Union countries may play in them. We've also talked about populism and governance of this agreement, and we even got some nice book recommendations from Professor Hans Jörg. So very much
professor,
a pleasure. Sorry. Yeah, you're right. Sorry. But indeed, one of the key researchers and analysts with Allianz, a huge financial and insurance company operating all over the world and with a very significant footprint, not just, of course, in Germany, but also in Spain. So pleasure to have you with us. We'll follow your research with Allianz. We'll be paying a lot of attention to the release of your book in English, which should be sometime in the future. And we thank you for sharing this time with us in the Instituto Juan de Mariana in Spain.
Thanks a lot, Diego. Great pleasure talking with you.
Thank you very much to you, and thank you very much to our audience. Muchas gracias. Volvemos pronto con una nueva entrevista.